-50 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, exposed skin freezes in under 10 minutes. Your breath turns to ice crystals before it leaves your lips. Steel becomes brittle enough to shatter. Now imagine standing outside in this. No electricity, no central heating, no insulated walls filled with fiberglass. Just you, the Arctic wind, and a house made of dirt. This sounds like a death sentence. But for over 500 years, Viking families, children, elderly, newborns, survived winters like this. Not in stone castles, not in heavily insulated fortresses, in houses built from grass and soil. And here's what makes no sense. Those dirt houses were warmer than your apartment. How is that possible? To understand how Vikings turned dirt into the most sophisticated heating system of the medieval world, well, we need to start with what they were actually building and why everything you think you know about primitive housing is wrong. Let's establish what Vikings were up against. Scandinavian winters weren't just cold, they were a 5-month siege. From November to March, temperatures regularly dropped below -30. In Iceland and Greenland, where Vikings established permanent settlements, -50 was not unusual. At these temperatures, survival isn't about comfort, it's about mathematics. The human body generates roughly 80 to 100 watts of heat at rest. That's barely enough to power a light bulb. Meanwhile, a poorly insulated house in -50 can lose heat at a rate of several thousand watts. The equation is simple. If heat loss exceeds heat generation, you die. Modern homes solve this with industrial solutions, while fiberglass insulation, double-pane windows, central heating systems burning fossil fuels. The average American home uses about 50 million BTUs per year just for heating. Vikings had none of this. What they had was wood, but not much of it. Scandinavia's forests were limited, and what timber existed was precious. Burning it all for heat meant no ships, no tools, no furniture. They had animal fat for lamps, but a single lamp produces maybe 40 watts. You'd need dozens burning constantly to heat a home. So they faced an impossible problem. How do you keep 40 people alive through 5 months of Arctic winter with almost no fuel? The answer wasn't more heat. It was less heat loss. And this is where Viking engineering becomes genuinely remarkable. Because the solution they developed, burying their homes under several feet of earth, wasn't primitive desperation. It was applied thermodynamics, 1,000 years before the science existed to explain why it worked. The Vikings didn't build houses. They engineered climate systems disguised as dirt mounds. Every element had a purpose. Every design choice followed principles that modern architects would recognize. Thermal mass, R-value, vapor barriers, passive solar orientation. They didn't have the vocabulary, but they had the knowledge, passed down through generations of trial, error, and frozen death. What looks like a pile of grass was actually the most sophisticated heating technology in medieval Europe. Let me show you how it worked. The foundation of Viking climate engineering was a principle we now call thermal mass. Here's how it works. Dig down about 4 feet into the earth, even in Scandinavia, even in winter. And something strange happens. The temperature stabilizes. While the surface freezes at -40, the soil 4 feet down hovers around 4 to 7 degrees Celsius. Not warm, but not frozen. The Vikings understood this instinctively. Their longhouses weren't built on the ground, they were built into it. The typical Viking earth house, called a turf house in Iceland, started with a pit. Workers dug down 3 to 5 feet, creating a rectangular depression. This wasn't just foundation work. This was borrowing heat from the earth itself. Then came the walls. And this is where the engineering gets clever. Viking walls weren't single-layer structures. They were composite systems, sometimes 4 to 6 feet thick, built in layers. First, with an inner wooden frame, birch or driftwood, whatever was available. This created the living space and provided structural support. Second, an insulating layer of birch bark or animal hides. This acted as a vapor barrier, preventing moisture from penetrating inward. Third, the earth itself. Layers of turf, grass with soil attached, stacked like enormous bricks. Each turf brick measured roughly 18 inches long, a foot wide, and 4 inches thick. A single wall might contain thousands of them. Fourth, an outer layer of growing grass, roots binding everything together. The result was a wall with an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of approximately R30 to R40. For comparison, modern building codes require only R13 to R21 for walls. Viking earth walls insulated nearly twice as well as your current home. But the thermal mass did something even more important than insulation. It stored heat. During the day, any warmth generated inside, body heat, cooking fires, oil lamps, was absorbed by those massive earthen walls. At night, when temperatures plummeted and the fire died down, the walls slowly released that stored heat back into the living space. This is passive thermal regulation. Modern architects call it thermal flywheel effect. The Vikings called it survival. A well-built turf house could maintain interior temperatures above freezing even when the fire went out completely. Even when the Arctic wind howled outside at -50, the interior would drop slowly, perhaps 1 degree per hour, giving families time to rekindle flames. The earth itself became their heating system. But thermal mass was only the first layer of their engineering. Look at any Viking earth house from above, and you'll notice something immediately. They're long and narrow. The classic Viking longhouse stretched 60 to 90 feet in length, but only 15 to 20 feet wide. This seems impractical. Why not build square? You'd get more floor space with less wall material. But the Vikings weren't optimizing for floor space. They were optimizing for heat. A narrow building has less exterior surface area relative to its interior volume. Less surface area means fewer places for heat to escape. The ideal shape for heat retention would be a sphere, but spheres are impossible to build with turf. A long rectangle was the next best option. The numbers matter here. A typical longhouse of 1,200 square feet had roughly 4,000 square feet of exterior surface, walls plus roof. A square building with the same floor space would have nearly 4,500 square feet of exterior surface. That's 12% more area bleeding heat into the Arctic night. 12% might not sound significant, but when you're surviving on body heat and a single hearth fire, 12% is the difference between waking up and not. Then there's the roof. Viking turf roofs were engineering marvels. They sloped at precisely calculated angles, steep enough to shed rain and snow, but not so steep that the turf would slide off. The typical pitch was about 45 degrees, sometimes supported by internal wooden pillars. The roofing material itself consisted of multiple layers. Inner wooden planks, birch bark waterproofing, then turf, sometimes 2 feet thick, grass side up. Living grass roots bound the whole structure together, creating a waterproof, insulating cap that actually improved over time as the vegetation thickened. And here's the detail that shows true sophistication. Orientation. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking longhouses were consistently aligned along a roughly east-west axis. The entrance faced south, toward the sun. The sleeping quarters were at the northern end, furthest from the door. This wasn't accident. This was passive solar design. In Scandinavian latitudes, the winter sun hangs low on the southern horizon. A south-facing entrance captured every available ray of sunlight, warming the interior during precious daylight hours. The northern sleeping quarters, buried deepest in earth and furthest from drafts, you stayed warmest through the night. The Vikings were practicing solar architecture a millennium before it had a name. Now let's step inside. The heart of every Viking longhouse was the long hearth. A rectangular fire pit running down the center of the building, sometimes 20 feet long or more. This wasn't just for cooking. It was the primary heat source for the entire structure. But here's what's remarkable. Vikings didn't need much fire. Modern estimates suggest a well-built turf house could maintain comfortable temperatures with surprisingly little fuel. A small fire, equivalent to burning perhaps 10 to 15 pounds of wood per day, was sufficient for a structure housing 30 to 40 people. Compare that to a medieval European stone house, which might burn 10 times as much fuel for a space half the size. And the secret was the earth envelope doing most of the work. The fire didn't need to heat the house. It just needed to offset the slow heat loss through those massive insulating walls. But fire creates a problem. Smoke. Breathing smoke for 5 months would kill you almost as surely as the cold. Viking longhouses needed ventilation. But ventilation means holes, and holes mean heat loss. This was a fundamental engineering tension. The solution was elegant. Controlled convection. At the peak of the roof, directly above the long hearth, Vikings left a smoke hole, a small opening that allowed smoke to escape. But the opening wasn't just a gap. Archaeological evidence suggests they used adjustable covers, animal hides, or wooden boards that could be opened or closed depending on conditions. When the fire burned hot and smoke filled the interior, the cover opened. When the fire died down and heat conservation became priority, the cover closed. But here's the clever part. The smoke itself provided insulation. Smoke is warm. A layer of warm smoke trapped in the rafters acts as a thermal barrier, preventing heat from escaping through the roof. Vikings tolerated a smoky interior because the smoke was helping keep them alive. The same principle applied to the entrance. Viking longhouse doors were small, barely 4 feet high in some cases. You didn't walk in. You crouched, sometimes passing through a short tunnel. This wasn't about defense, though it helped with that too. Small doors meant small heat loss. Every opening was a calculated trade-off between ventilation and insulation. And in that balance, the Vikings made their choice. Survival first, comfort second. A smoky, low-ceilinged, cramped space that kept 40 people alive through 5 months of darkness. This was life at -50. There's one heat source we haven't discussed yet. The most reliable, renewable, constantly operating heating system in any Viking longhouse. The people themselves. Remember that number from earlier. The human body generates 80 to 100 watts of heat at rest. That's not much individually, but collectively. A typical Viking household included extended family, grandparents, parents, children, sometimes servants, and slaves. 30 to 40 people was common. Do the math. 40 bodies generating 80 watts each produces 3,200 watts of continuous heat. That's equivalent to running 3 space heaters, 24 hours a day, using no fuel at all. And this is why Viking families slept together. Archaeological remains show sleeping platforms, raised wooden benches along the interior walls, where entire families lay side by side under layers of wool blankets and animal furs. Privacy didn't exist, but warmth did. The livestock helped too. In the coldest regions, Iceland, Greenland, northern Norway, Vikings often shared their longhouses with animals. One end of the building housed cattle, sheep, and goats. A partial wall separated them from the human living quarters, but not completely. This sounds uncomfortable. It was. Animal smells, animal noises, animal waste, all of it present in the living space. But each cow generates roughly 400 watts of heat. A small herd of 5 or 6 animals added another 2,000 watts to the interior. Combined with human body heat, that's 5,000 watts of free heating, enough to meaningfully raise interior temperatures even without fire. The Vikings accepted animal cohabitation because the alternative was freezing. And this brings us to a larger truth about Viking survival. It was collective. There was no individual solution to -50 winters. No single person could generate enough heat, gather enough fuel, or build thick enough walls to survive alone. Survival required community, extended families, shared labor, pooled body heat. The earth house was literally designed for togetherness. The long hearth where everyone gathered. The communal sleeping platforms, the single entrance that everyone shared. The architecture itself encoded interdependence. This is sophisticated thermodynamics masquerading as primitive communal living. So where does this leave us today? The average American home is roughly 2,300 square feet, about the same as a large Viking longhouse. It's climate controlled to exactly 68 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. It requires about 50 million BTUs annually to maintain that temperature. To produce those BTUs, we burn natural gas, propane, heating oil, or electricity generated from fossil fuels. We pump carbon into the atmosphere. We pay hundreds or thousands of dollars per year. We depend entirely on supply chains, power grids, and global energy markets. The Vikings spent nothing. Their fuel was body heat, small fires, and the earth itself. Their insulation grew naturally on the roof. Their climate system required no external inputs once built, just human presence. Modern architects have started rediscovering these principles. Earth-sheltered homes, passive house design, thermal mass construction, green roofs. These aren't new innovations. They're ancient wisdom, repackaged with scientific vocabulary. In Iceland, some traditional turf houses survived into the 20th century, not as museums, but as functioning homes. Families lived in them. Children were raised in them. The houses worked just as they had for 1,000 years. But let me be clear. I'm not romanticizing this. Viking earth houses were dark, smoky, cramped. Privacy was non-existent. The work of maintaining them, cutting turf, replacing rotted wood, keeping the drainage working, was endless. Life expectancy was short. Disease spread easily in crowded conditions. The Vikings didn't build earth houses because they loved them. They built them because the alternative was death. But in that constraint, in the brutal necessity of -50 survival, they developed solutions that we're only now beginning to appreciate. Passive heating, natural insulation, collective living, harmony with landscape instead of domination over it. There's something humbling about this. 1,000 years ago, people with no thermometers, no building codes, no engineering degrees, figured out how to keep families alive in conditions that would kill most modern people in hours. They did it through observation, experimentation, and accumulated wisdom passed from parent to child. If you're finding this engineering fascinating, consider subscribing. We explore forgotten innovations like this every week, and there's so much more to discover about how our ancestors solved impossible problems. Somewhere in Iceland, buried under centuries of grass and neglect, the remains of Viking earth houses still exist. The wooden frames have rotted. The roofs have collapsed. The hearths are cold, have been cold for generations. But if you dig down, past the accumulated soil and tangled roots, you can still find them. The impressions of where families lived, slept, survived. Stand in one of these ruins on a winter night, and you can almost feel it. The wind howling outside, the snow piling against the entrance, the darkness pressing in for months without end. And inside, huddled around a small fire, packed together on sleeping platforms, sharing warmth with livestock and relatives and strangers who became family through necessity. 40 people surviving what should have been unsurvivable. They didn't have our technology, our resources, our knowledge. But they had something we're in danger of losing. The understanding that survival is not individual, that comfort is not the same as warmth, that the earth itself, treated properly, gives back more than we put in. The next time you adjust your thermostat, think about what that action represents. The electricity flowing through wires, the gas flowing through pipes, the global infrastructure keeping your home at exactly 68 degrees. Then think about a family in Iceland, 1,000 years ago, achieving the same goal with grass and dirt and each other. They didn't know the science, but they understood something deeper. Warmth isn't just temperature, it's the people you survive with.